Good afternoon. Welcome to Pequot Library. How's everyone doing? Come on in. Thank you. I'm Stephanie Coakley, Pequot Library's Executive Director. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to those joining us from home. Welcome. And thank you for coming out to hear our special program today with two creative legends, Guy Trebay and Chris Frantz. I want to, before I begin, give a shout out to M Communications, who's in the rear of the room helping us record today's program. Thank you, Thomas, for being here. This will be an unforgettable, engaging afternoon, exactly the kind of unique, exclusive, and educational programming that we're so proud to provide here at Pequot Library. For those of you that may be new, I hope you'll take some time to explore the library immediately after the program. It goes without saying, we're so honored to host today's program. As most of you know, we offer nearly all of our programs, free of charge. And we couldn't do that without the generosity of our business community, our grantors, our foundations, our individual donors. So thank you so much for your support. It is my honor to introduce today's speakers, Guy Trebay and Chris Frantz. Guy Trebay's... No. There will be a big round of applause when we introduce you to the Pequot Library stage. Guy Trebay's New York Times notable book, Do Something, Coming of Age Amid the Glitter and Doom of 70s New York, is an evocative coming-of-age memoir, the story of the education of a wayward wild child and an acid head who, searching for meaning and purpose, found refuge in the demimonde of the ruined but magical metropolis that was New York City in the 1970s. The New York Times Book Review writes, in his beautiful memoir, Guy Trebay paints a picture of a vanished, pre-AIDS Gotham that's both gritty and dazzling. Guy has chronicled culture both high and low for decades, writing for The New Yorker, The Village Voice, Interview, Esquire, and Art Forum. He has served as a style reporter and critic for The New York Times for the last 2 decades. Guy will be in conversation with our friend Chris Frantz, drummer, composer, and producer with the bands Talking Heads and Tom Tom Club, member of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and with Tina Weymouth, hi Tina, a regular at Pequot Library events. Chris published his memoir, Remain in Love, Talking Heads, Tom Tom Club, Tina, in the summer of 2020, some of his memoir being written right here at Pequot Library. Craig Kennedy from Barrett Books in Darien is with us in the rear of the room, and books will be available for purchase. Guy and Chris have generously offered to stay after the program to sign books. Without further ado, let's give a big round of applause and welcome Guy Trebay and Chris Frantz to the Pequot Library stage.
Which do you prefer, Guy? Hi. So great of you all to come on this snowy day, but Guy Trebay is well worth it because super cool and a very interesting, great raconteur.
No pressure at all.
Yeah. I got my notes because I don't want to forget anything. Welcome, Guy, to our beautiful New England village.
It's incredible. I've never been here.
And the library itself, look at this room. So great.
I'm actually not going to leave.
I know people that went to dancing school in this room. Yeah, those were the days. So, you grew up, or at least a great deal of your youth, right across the Sound, correct?
I did, yeah, on the North Shore of Long Island.
North Shore of Long Island?
Having started out in the Bronx in
Yes.
early days. My parents had a place in the city, and then my dad hit the jackpot with cologne that he had come up with, a very period called Hawaiian Surf, and we moved up like the Jeffersons.
Yeah. You know, when I read Hawaiian Surf, I said, is that me? I said, holy mackerel, because I went to school in Virginia, and high school, and it was fashionable for young men to have cologne, like their girlfriends would give it to them for Christmas and stuff like that. Usually it was English leather. The richer people had canoe, something called canoe, but I had Hawaiian Surf.
You did not.
I did, in the cork bottle, and the reason I loved Hawaiian Surf was because I never surfed in my life, but I had a picture on my dormitory wall, a big poster of surfers and the giant waves at Waimea Bay, and I thought, Hawaiian Surf, that's the one for me.
And you're why I'm here.
I wish I still had the bottle.
Funnily enough, somebody just sent me a bottle, and when I was doing the research for the book, I never could find, it's on eBay, you can find them, but I never could find an intact, fully intact shrink wrap bottle, and I literally just got it the other day.
And was the scent familiar to you?
Well, it's shrink wrapped, so I really couldn't smell through the bottle. But I have other bottles that I have found that have a little, dregs in it, and maybe it smells the same. I don't know how reliable olfactory memory is.
Yeah.
It was not, I don't think that it was a stellar fragrance.
Well, but you begin the book with talking about your family. And it occurred to me when I finished the book, where you're also speaking very personally and deeply about your family, that's what the book is about. It's about, at least to me, it seemed like it's about having a family, dealing with that family, but also, once you leave that family and move to the big city, creating new families that you can carry on with, have fun with, go out to dinner with.
I believe that did happen in a way. I mean, obviously, I guess in a sense, the thing about the book is that it has a lot to do with the way in which we carry our families with us forever. There's sort of immutable, they're a permanent condition, whatever. I was at dinner with some friends last night, and they were surprised that I had dedicated the book to my siblings. And if you read the book, which I hope people will do, we had a very, very chaotic family life, and the book begins with our house burning down. It's a funny thing about the California fires, which I'm very sensitive to, is we all, of course, feel sympathetic, but how profoundly that is with you for the whole of your life when you've had a house burned down is something that you only know if you've had it happen, and that's something that my siblings and I share. And albeit, in my case, we were scattered, a lot of very dramatic things happened in our upbringing. The book is very, very much about kind of resolving and getting to a place of understanding and compassion and forgiveness. I didn't intend it to be that, but as I wrote, that's what it became.
Yes.
And I did, of course, as we all do, find my people in New York. I really honestly don't know whether you would find people in quite the same way. Obviously, everybody comes to New York and gets something out of it. But the machinery of New York is very different now from the way that it was then, substantially having to do, I think, with real estate. Because you could live cheaply. And cities need margins, they need cheap housing for creative people. You can't have a city that's based on people getting $1 million starter apartment from daddy. It's not going to generate a lot. It's not going to create the Tom Tom Club. Not that you guys arose initially in New York, but
Yeah. We,
or Talking Heads, I should say, in proper order.
yeah. Yeah, it was easy to make that monthly rent. Tina and I shared a loft with David Byrne on Christie Street. It was $289 a month. So it was about 1,800 square feet or something like that, wasn't it, Tina? No? How many? Oh, 1,100.
Oh, a mere 1,100. Right.
But anyway, we could do that.
And one could, and I think that the city that I describe in the book, and the city in which I came of age, the city that made me possible, you wouldn't know it without reading the book, but I dropped out of I was kind of a crazy kid and took a lot of drugs and dropped out of high school, more or less, I think, to get out of this totally chaotic family situation. And but the city could receive one. You know, you could join the gig economy. You could make stuff. This again, I was talking about with friends yesterday. That lots of people that I was last night with a friend who was the curator of the Costume Institute at the Metropolitan Museum of Art for many years. He was saying that when he first came to New York, which is more or less contemporaneous, he made and sold at Henry Bendel's dresses of some sort made out of dish rags. The problem was that nobody had a business idea, so once you'd sold the first batch of dish rag dresses, you didn't know how to make the next one when they ordered them. So this was something similar happened for us, for myself, who at that point wanted to be a painter and could, in the gig economy, could live. A painter pal with whom I lived in a $75 a month apartment made hippie handbags, which, to our utter surprise, completely succeeded, particularly when Ally McGraw was photographed wearing one in Vogue. Then we were in business, and what do you do?
Yeah, I remember that photo. It was everywhere.
Yeah, Ally remembers it.
Yeah. And you sold them at Henry Bendel?
Yeah, I mean, because in those days, this again has to do with the kind of a city that is no more. And as I've been going around with the book, I've been pretty assiduous about avoiding what I call geezer gab, because the city is always going to be a very vital and yeasty place, and people will find their way. But I think that the availability of, and also the importance to people of creative things. Money wasn't the only value. The bankers hadn't won yet in New York, and it was perfectly acceptable to be. I write in the book that various people. So I was making underground films. Everybody was doing a variety of things without a career plan. I certainly did not have a 5-year plan, perhaps not a 5-minute plan, and it was fine. It was really fine, and a lot of the people that I knew were living, combination of gig economy, but also, let's put it this way, to get on welfare was like getting a Ford Foundation grant.
Yeah. I remember, speaking of Bendel's, where Tina worked, her first job was at Henry Bendel when we moved to New York. And David worked at some advertising agency making posters for, what was it? One of those colognes. and I was a little further down the street at Design Research. But I remember going uptown every morning on the subway, and how it was a pretty dramatic switch from Christie Street to 57th Street.
Yeah. I mean, the Christie Street of then, for sure.
Yeah.
Less so now. Now it's an inversion. Now Christie Street is, the Fifth Avenue in a certain sense. It's unapproachable financially, and Bendel's is gone. So.
Yes.
All the B's are gone. Bendel's, Bergdorf's, Bonwit, Burger Heaven.
So, backtracking a little bit, I think it's interesting that I think it was one of your first job, if not at least one of your first jobs, working at a record company, a record pressing plant.
Right. Yeah.
With this fabulous black girl named Lorraine, and you were making 45 records?
Yeah, this is a very odd thing that I find if I'm talking to people, people who are, if I'm talking to what I call youngs. I have to explain first that there was such a thing as 45 records. Then I have to explain that they didn't come with holes in them, you know. You had to put the holes in them. And so one completely stoned out summer, that was my summer job, and I would stand on an assembly line as the records, it happened to be Canned Heat's Going to the Country, I think, and some Stones record were being pressed at that plant, which it turns out is a pivotal place in the history of the vinyl industry. Just putting these things as this very, very treacherous thing came down. And how I did not lose my fingers, I don't know. But in break time, there was an alley alongside this thing that was in Huntington Station, New York. And Lorraine, my coworker, does anybody remember those little, like, folding, nobody can remember this but me, but the little folding battery-operated record players.
Yeah.
I can't remember the brand at the minute. And so she came to work with that little record player, and she had a very, very tidy little box of Herb records, and we would go out in the alley and smoke weed and dance, because of course.
Fabulous.
And she was very, very, she was very anal, I guess, and had everything filed alphabetically, and we only listened to black music, which was, I already had a disposition to like and love black music, and so it became very formative for me in lots of other ways. Black music, black culture, and but Lorraine was my point of entry.
I love the spelling of her name,
Lwraine.
Yes.
Apostrophe, sorry.
Okay, so the Bronx. Now, when I moved to New York, I don't think I ever went to the Bronx. Once I went to Riverdale. Somebody had rented an apartment.
You kind of skipped the Bronx to get to Riverdale.
But you kept going back to the Bronx, didn't you?
I have a lot of love for the Bronx. I mean, I was born in Bronx Hospital, but it's not that Bronx was my identity, but I really love the Bronx. It's kind of the forgotten borough. No longer forgotten because the developers have gotten to it finally. But we just happened on an apartment that was in the very far North Bronx. And because everybody cool did not live in the far North Bronx or any part of the Bronx, everybody lived on Christie Street, where we should have been looking. We called it our country house.
Yeah.
Because it was far. I mean, we had to go quite a long way to get downtown on the D.
Yeah, and I was going to say, you must have spent a lot of time on the subway.
Yeah, and the thing about the spending time on the subway, which I again have trouble communicating, is in those days, well, I mean, I again have white hair, but in those days I had a bleached platinum crew cut. And the woman with whom I lived had she had an extravagant physical presentation, and people would move to the other side of the subway or cross the street. Now, of course, when everybody has like septum piercings and whatever, you can't believe that it was the case, but we were a spectacle.
Well, speaking of spectacles, you became friends with Jackie Curtis and Holly Woodlawn, and I guess numerous drag queens, who I presume were down in the East Village.
They did, yeah. Jackie lived on 2nd Avenue.
Yeah.
Candy, if anybody knows who Candy Darling was, these people were Warhol superstars. And so in that period, the epicenter was, of course, the Lower East Side, but people like Candy, about whom there is an excellent new biography by a colleague of mine, Cynthia Carr. And Candy never had a fixed abode. She couch surfed. She really never had a nickel. And she was a little bit sex worker adjacent, I think. And it was, I think one thing that I wanted to communicate, I did in the book, and I hope to communicate beyond that, is the kind of porosity that made for culture. Do you know what I mean? New York was tribal. There were this kind of, just as there were these congeries of little ethnic enclaves and, little this and little Poland and little Italy and little Germany and little whatever, There also were these kind of tribes that inhabited the various parts of Manhattan, and we communicated maybe by smoke signals, because obviously pre-digital, but they overlapped in a way that I think nowadays they do not. I mean, they will do that. Digitally, people can be very, in touch with each other. But these tribes kind of blended into each other in quite strange ways, in my experience of it. And so I couldn't say that I only hung out with drag queens, but of course you would know these people. And everybody in a way was migrating toward the factory, toward the Warhol factory, because
Right.
I think that for a lot of people was wherever you started, you knew that that was the world you wanted to get to.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's fair to say that the reason I moved to New York was because Andy Warhol was there, and Lou Reed was there,
Right.
and yes, Candy Darling was there.
Right.
It was.
And it's a funny sequential thing because, everybody knows, I mean, to the extent that people know Candy Darling, they of course know her from the Lou Reed song. As it happens, Lou didn't know Candy Darling when he wrote the song.
That's
So
so
it
wild.
was, it was this kind of osmotic thing happening where people filtered into each other's, he did of course ultimately know her, but
Yeah.
filtered into each other's consciousness.
Yeah. So you ended up working at Max's Kansas City,
Yes,
I think briefly.
I wasn't cut out for the service industry.
It's such a funny story. I don't want to spoil it for people who are going to read the
Go
book.
for it.
It's really funny. Was Mickey Ruskin a good guy to you?
I wasn't cut out for the service
No.
industry.
Okay. You talk about how the drag queens, and I know Andy Warhol did it too, and a lot of people in the rock and roll milieu have done this, about changing your history, your life story, making stuff up about yourself as if you felt that I'm just not interesting enough. I got to make something up to make myself seem to be more interesting. And you talk about sharing a desire to metamorphose. That's so good, metamorphose.
Especially the way you say it.
I felt that way myself, and
But you kept your name.
yeah, I kept my name.
See, a lot of the people, I think that the denominator was that the people that I knew at that time were, very uncontented. Identity now in a different way is contested, it's mutable, it's seen as mutable, and that includes gender. And I think, in a way, I'm even hesitant to think of those people as drag, because they didn't, like Jackie Curtis, for example, said, I'm not a boy, I'm not a girl, I'm not a man, I'm a woman, I'm Jackie. And I think kind of that's where we've come. Or where we're headed in terms of understanding gender identity and the plurality that's basic to, just to humanity, any human. But that being said, everybody wanted a better backstory, and so Holly Woodlawn, who was one of these nuts, super creative, super hilarious, but was born Harold Dankal in Puerto Rico, ginned up this crazy narrative, among other things claiming to be the heiress of the Woodlawn Cemetery fortune. Because, you would do that. And Candy Darling had been she'd had many names before she settled on Candy, and many identities. She kind of was a work in progress, and ultimately fixed on a physical presentation that was, if this makes any sense, or if you can track this, it was Kim Novak doing the tragic silent film star Gene Eagles in, I can't remember the name of the film. So she came up with this kind of anesthetized purr that was the Candy Darling voice, which was many generations removed from Gene Eagles via Kim Novak. So in other words, everybody saw themselves and also saw the city as the proscenium, let's say, for the theater of self.
Yeah.
I sometimes think about this when I imagine all of the people that I knew walking around, myself not excluded, the people who crossed the street. What were they thinking? What did they think we were? Or if you saw these apparitions, they were just going to their work,
Yeah, I had the opportunity to meet Jackie Curtis a couple of times through mutual friends when she was not really in drag at all, dressed like a boy.
Right.
Yeah.
And often enough, she was not. I mean, or yeah, I'll use the feminine pronoun, but there's a scene in the book where I was at Jackie's loft, and I'd been brought there by a friend, and Jackie had a loft that was above the Yiddish theater, and her grandmother had a bar across the street called Slugger Ann's, and and Jackie was, well, like a lot of these people, was quite drug-addled and didn't last that long. I mean, most everybody died pretty young. Initially, before the AIDS pandemic, a lot of people died of the drugs. And Jackie was wandering crazily around the apartment, sort of half made up, shaving her chest, but sort of she was half shaved and then half hairy, and there's a kind of crazy guy that she'd slept with the night before wandering around looking for a joint. And it's one of those things where you're like, I have no idea why I'm here.
Yeah, I'll bet. So you also went to work at Interview.
I did.
And what did you do at Interview
I as I say, I started out wanting to be a painter. We all started out, I think, wanting to be artists or with the intention of being artists, and then I did the very last thing I ever wanted to do was be a writer. And but it happened that a pal of mine then who very much did intend to be a writer, I guess I can say, swiped an idea that I had that I thought would be an interesting story. There was a very famous, let's call her a nightclub personality, or chanteuse from the 20s, who was in New York at the time, called Bricktop, and legendary in Paris, an amazing character. And I said, this person would be so interesting to write about, and this friend, in those days known as Elaine Richardson, she later became, in a way that I'll explain in a second, Jamaica Kincaid, took the idea, very like this person, I must say. And she took it to Interview, and they gave her a job to write about Bricktop. And I said, well, I mean, if she can do it, I'm sure I can do it. So, and really that was how I started writing. I mean, let's say the barrier to entry was not that high.
So what year would that have been?
I think it would have to have been about 72, something like that. That Interview was
so
very new.
Yeah, that was a new, early days for Interview.
But I was very quickly quite pretentious, though, because I wouldn't do Q&As. I would, so I started getting these jobs. I mean, because I think that maybe there was not a lot of competition. And I wanted to write. If it was going to be writing, it was going to be writing. It wasn't going to be Q&As, which was counter their programming. They wanted Q&As because they wanted writers were, well, again, this is again kind of come back in the culture. The writers are being downplayed. Celebrities, dial up the celebrity.
So you made friends around the East Village, the West Village, downtown, Soho, I guess, early days of Soho. And you mentioned Anna Sui.
Sure.
And Stephen Meisel,
Yeah,
who were unknown at the time,
true.
but made a big mark. You also mentioned Richard Soule as being a friend, and I knew Richard Soule a little bit, but he was very quiet.
Very
at
quiet
CBGB's.
guy. Richard Soule was the pianist for Patti Smith.
Yeah.
And who, I have to frame this in a tactful way. When you are writing fairy tales, I guess you can include characters and leave characters out as you wish, and he does not at all appear in her book. And it's a sad-making thing for me because one of the goals when I was writing the book was to again, it sounds a bit pretentious, but to bear witness, because there was this entire generation of people, including Richard, who was one of the early AIDS deaths, just was vanished, right? And I think it's very important to restore them to their centrality in the culture. They were my friends, of course, but they laid a lot of the groundwork for the culture that we benefit from now. I mean, benefit, you can decide for yourself, but if anybody had told me in those days that at some point RuPaul's Drag Race would be smack in the middle of the culture. It would be unimaginable, but there was a basis on which that came to be. All of this gender exploration was being fomented by people who, if you track like civil rights into feminism, into gay liberation, and then there's this great efflorescence of culture generated by these guys who suddenly find that they don't have to be florists and hairdressers, with all respect to florists and hairdressers, and they start making culture. But then there's a mass die-off. So I feel very protective of people like Richard and the many, many, many guys, and not exclusively guys, who died.
Yeah. I was following the Patti Smith group down at CBGB's, and well, it was just Patti and Lenny Kaye on guitar. Then they added Richard Soul, and it just went so much higher.
Right, he was a much more,
musically
he was a classically
speaking.
trained
He was like a
musician.
genius.
Yeah, he was a lovely, and also a lovely, lovely guy.
He knew exactly how to create an atmosphere beyond what was just Patty's sort of speed freak rantings.
Thank you.
Yes.
I'll leave it at that. But yeah. But interestingly, Richard plays a very funny role in my life and in the trajectory of the book, in the narrative, because he and I and another one of the Warhol people, in my estimation, the most interesting of the drag characters, who went by the name of Silva Thin. And Silva Thin and Richard and I, for what reason I know not, decided we were going to track down Greta Garbo, who was very much around New York in those days. And you could kind of, we stalked her anyway. The three of us, we plotted it out, we split up. She was either going to be on 3rd Avenue, where she would be, she used to haunt the junk shops on 3rd Avenue, or whatever she was doing, skulking around. We never found her, but while we were doing that, while we were all each out reconnoitering, I came upon this scene that in a lot of ways, I mean, I wasn't aware of it at the time, but it awakened in me what became the beginnings of a journalistic career, because I for many, well, not many, many decades, but some amount of decades, what I mostly wrote about before fashion, style, and all the rest of it was the city life, urban life, that including when crack happened and what have you. But while we were out ranging, and here's Silva dressed like, looking basically like Garbo, there's Richard with this nimbus of angelic blonde curls, and myself looking like whatever I looked like, I came upon these guys who were pigeon pirates. They don't have it anymore, but once in a while you would see people catching it, and they would seed the sidewalk and net. When they had hundreds of pigeons, they would net the pigeons. And there's a lot of this debate as to what they were going to do with the pigeons. A lot of urban legends around this, and were they being brought to, shooting clubs in Pennsylvania, or were they, or were they going to turn up as squab on French restaurant menus? Who knows? But this was so fascinating to me that I thought, this is what I want to do. I don't want to be doing Q&As or any kind of thing for Andy Warhol's interview. I want to find out what this is. I want to find this out about the city and write about this. I mean, it didn't crystallize in that moment, but I realize now that was the basis.
Cool. Garbo. I never saw her.
Nor did I.
You didn't find her either?
No, you didn't find her.
I would see photographs in like the Voice or something like that. There goes Garbo. But I did see, it was great in New York. You would see like Johnny Carson walking down the street coming your way, or Catherine Deneuve, or Jackie O.
Jackie, I don't think Johnny Carson would have been a high-value get for me, but there was another funny thing that happened in the New York of then, which it is in the book very much, and it's been very much on my mind, is that you had this kind of very odd thing where the city, the hardscape had changed very little from the 30s and wouldn't change too terribly much until 2000. Yeah, 2000. And so you had this kind of, basically the hardscape of the city was 1930s. It was the New York of movies. It was of cinema, right? And it was populated in this way that people have tended to forget by all the European emigres who'd been forced out of Europe, all the high cultural refugees, and also all the people who'd been forced out of Hollywood by the death of the Hollywood studio system. So suddenly you're walking around, you would see Archer Rubinstein, you would see Lillian Gish. There's a scene in the book where I'm sitting, does anybody remember the Automat?
Oh, yeah.
And so I'm sitting in the Automat. I was at that point working as a bank messenger, ferrying gold coins around because obviously nobody's going to give me gold coins, so they're not going to knock me over for the gold coins. But anyway, I'm sitting in the Automat window, and just as in a D.W. Griffith movie comes, because the wind on 57th Street is very strong, comes this creature like teetering into the wind, and it's Lillian Gish. Now, I guess I was a kind of weird kid that I knew it was Lillian Gish, but they were there.
Yes.
They were all there.
Yeah.
And available in a strange way that people would later not be.
I remember standing on a street corner next to Tony Randall, who was talking to himself very loudly. And also, you would see Paul Newman, who lived in this neighborhood, and you just see everybody on 57th Street anyway.
57th for sure. But I mean, they were really very much around. And I think that, again, this goes to this idea of porosity. The book is about again. I imagine you can write to famous people. People DM on Instagram or whatever, and there is an availability. But I wrote notes to people. I wrote to Anita Luce, if anybody knows who that is, that wrote Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. And she replied, and then we became very good.
When I first moved to New York, there were a lot of like loft parties and sort of after-hours clubs that were in people's lofts. But the 10th floor was like a precursor to Studio 54.
Right.
Or
really to all private clubs, and it was also a precursor in a funny way to a kind of to this more available, more out in the open gay culture, because it was again, it was a gig economy thing. We had a friend who went by the name of Andrea Lucidity because she worked in a store that sold clear plastic things, and she knew some guys who were opening some crazy club in the Garment District on the 10th floor of a loft building, and did we need a job? And yes, we did need a job. And the woman with whom I was then living was a painter. I was at this point becoming a writer. And so we went there and we got these jobs. I was the juice boy, whatever. It was they didn't serve alcohol. It hadn't opened when we went. It hadn't yet opened. So it was a very, very novel idea. Private clubs were a novel idea. Private dance clubs were a novel idea. Disco hadn't really happened yet. And so this was a very, very seminal place. It turns out it turned up most famously in Andrew Holleran's book called Dancer from the Dance, which is set set in the 10th floor, which he calls the 12th floor. And so we got this job. She was the coat check girl. Why? Nobody had coats. I was the juice boy. Why? Because they didn't serve alcohol, but I could barely be bothered to serve the people the juice because all I cared about was getting on the dance floor. So I would do an obligatory round of juice filling and then just ignore the job and dance.
I remember, did you ever meet a guy named Seymour Avigdor?
The name sounds familiar.
He was a fabric designer for Angelo Donghia. Really top-notch designer. And he would take us to these clubs where they'd say, be careful, don't drink the punch. And...
But I didn't understand how people seemed to be so up.
Uh-huh.
Because I didn't do, at that point, I basically stopped doing all drugs when I was 19, and I had quite a drug career, although obviously no one has a drug career. And but I never really did drugs again. I had a little, moment in the 80s, but other than that, never again. So, and this was the beginning of a lot of drug taking for people, but everybody would do it before the club.
Uh-huh.
And I wised up because by closing time, and in this place, it was a members only, gay-centric but not gay-exclusive place, but famous people came there. So it was the beginning of that idea of famous people getting into, or being part of a very clubby little thing. And so Grace Jones was there, and Andy was there, and Calvin Klein, and all of those people. Grace Jones, no one believes me when I say this, but she literally was there one night and danced. Well, she had on shoes, but other than that, naked. It's just that was in New York.
That's Grace, too.
That's right. That's Grace.
Isn't it fabulous that she's still going strong?
Yes, now she does it with a hula hoop.
It's really something.
Has anybody seen her hula hooping? She's fully hula hooping at 75 in her act.
Yes. Okay. AIDS came along, which was, so bad. You speak in, I think, very movingly about how bad it was, about how tragic it was, and how it just decimated a certain population in New York. Well, what can we say about that?
The thing that I would like to say about that is that you didn't really know what was happening.
Yeah.
And so now I look back, COVID did this, because during COVID suddenly, when COVID was happening and people were dying in this very, very strange way without a lot of government information, and people are dying, unnecessarily in many instances, I was like, wait a minute, I did this already, and so the difference being now I'm old and then I was young, and I was to experience that much death before you're 30, and people died very, very horrible deaths. I mean, I don't want to be a gloomy Gus about this, but it was really, really dire, and it taught one a lot about community, because the ways in which people came together, generally a pretty despised class of people came together for each other when the culture didn't want to help, the government definitely didn't want to help. And it was really, I think clearly it will be with one for life, the aftermath of that. But at the time, it really was just, this is so mysterious, the ways in which people, because now there are pills, of course, that can deal with the antiretrovirals, but nobody knew what it was called, nobody knew what caused it, all the stuff that everybody in this room is aware of. But to be in the middle of it, and as I say in the book, and I probably could stand on street corners and talk about this, these were the people making culture.
Yes.
And then one by one, they just vanished. And it became there was a period in New York when I had to recalibrate the way that I navigated the city, because it was too ghost haunted. And there were too many places where I'd round a corner and there'd be a ghost. And so I changed my routes.
I know that Lou Reed shared that feeling with you about ghosts in New York. Of course, he wrote a song about it called The Halloween Parade. It's a pretty good song.
Right.
On a more cheerful note, Adam Purple. You write about Adam Purple, and we used to see him all the time on Houston Street in Bowery on his bicycle. This was a guy who was a gardener. It turns out he was like an organic farmer in the middle of the Lower East Side.
Yeah, he took an extraordinary guy. He actually had a very conventional background. I didn't know it at the time. I ultimately wrote a story about him in the Village Voice. But he would be seen around the city with on a bike. He wore head to toe tie-dyed purple. And he had a long beard. I mean, he was almost prototypically like a beatnik or a hippie or something like that. But he wore this strange garb. He had a tie-dyed bicycle, at the back of which was I don't know how to pronounce this word, travois, like or like a pannier on wheels. And he went to because the city was being knocked down at that point, quite a lot of it. And he would scavenge construction sites for debris, bricks, column capitals and so on, and bring them back to this lot that he had colonized in the Lower East Side, and turned it into this really a glorious garden called the Garden of Eden. And it had this concentric circle of bricks, and he had very advanced gardening ideas, but the most important part about it is that he was taking back this unused urban space. Ultimately, it was, of course, when the Lower East Side became a place that developers wanted to get hold of it, the garden was raised.
Yeah, it's a shame.
But the part I'm leaving out, sorry, buried the lead, my specialty. He would go up to Central Park with this thing on the back of his bike and collect the horse manure from the carriage horses. That was what he was most famous for composting.
Yeah. But you would never know that seeing him just ride down the street, because he just looked like, well, he looked like something from Haight-Ashbury or something
Yes, very
like
much
that.
so. But also that kind of mad apparition that was very much a feature of city life.
Yeah.
I feel. I mean, I don't see those people anymore. Before him, there would have been a Moon Dog, if anybody remembers
Yeah.
Moon Dog, who was this guy who stood in Viking drag on the corner of 6th Avenue outside the CBS building.
Yeah.
Allegedly a blind, and he ultimately Moondog cut records. He had a book,
Yeah, I think Frank Zappa signed him.
probably.
Yeah. So you mentioned a bar where we once shot a video called Sally's, which is across. Yeah, which is across
Okay.
from
Okay, you
the
snuck
New
that
York
one up on
Times,
me.
right?
Yeah,
It's
it
right by the
was.
New York Times, and is it still there?
No,
Too bad.
no.
But tell me what you know about Sally's.
Well, Sally's is not a place I would have frequented. Sally's was how could you even explain Sally's? I mean, it was a bar that was frequented by mostly trans women and their appreciators, let's say. And yeah, so that was Sally's. And some of the characters that I knew people there, but it was really another category of people, mostly people who were, I think, sex workers.
Yeah.
And it was literally opposite the front door to the then New York Times building. The Times moved to 8th Avenue some while back, and it was just so anomalous because here you have the gray lady, and over here you have the very painted lady. But
Yeah. We shot a video there called, the song was called "Don't Take My Kindness for Weakness." It seemed
and
to
that would be something that any of the women in there would have been able to tell you about.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Because they could cut a bitch.
And then somehow, before Madonna even, you became very interested in the voguing. What do you
Probably it's through the Vogue, my friends who were in the voguing ballroom community, whom I would have met in some kind of way through friends, exactly as I say. I know it sounds very illogical, because like had I had an ordinary trajectory and gone to college, I would have been in a frat and known the people I knew, and I'd have carried them through my life with me. But the people that I knew were whoever anybody introduced me to, and so I fell in with these various people, some of whom took me to Sally's, some of whom took me wherever. But the voguing people had existed since long, long back. It was a very, very developed scene and community, and I became acquainted with some of these people and ultimately became quite close to a variety of them, including Dorian Corey and Willie Ninja, who was the most famous for dancing of the dancers. And it was he appears in, I think, Madonna's Vogue video, which there's a lot of controversy over whether she was, exalting it or ripping it off, but I'm glad that it exists as a document. As does the Jenny Livingston film from '92 called Paris is Burning, which I think is the foundational document of voguing.
Yes, and so Dorian Corey, after she passed away, was found to have had.
Yes, drag queen has a mummy in her closet. She did.
I remember the headlines.
It was on all the headlines. The thing about, so Dorian Corey was one of these people, but a kind of a progenitor of what later became the voguing house. She was early. By the time I met her, she would have been she died I think at 54. But so to my young self, she was quite old at that time, but she would have been in her 40s, let's say. And I used to go, she had an apartment on St. Nicholas Avenue, and I would go there and play Scrabble. She was a Scrabble fiend. And very, very wise person, born Frederick Legg in Buffalo, New York. And but but not drag, really like a trans person. And famous, in earlier days, famous for feather reviews and from that genre. And anyway, so we would play Scrabble, myself little knowing that in the next room was this person who somebody killed. I don't know who killed him. Nobody ever could figure it out. All duct taped and stuffed in a Naugahyde suitcase. I did wonder at the time why the apartment always smelled so strongly of this incense called Night Queen, but
Oh boy. And okay. You write so lovingly about both of your sisters, and I felt particularly the one who was the bank robber.
not a bank robber.
Oh, pardon me.
But the funny thing about this is I'm appealing to you because it sounds as if I've written about 10 books in this book. I mean, nothing seems like it's sequential at all. I promise you it is a book and it holds together as a book, but it doesn't seem logical any more than I suppose any of our lives in some way seems logical. So as it happens, in the year 1975, an enormous number of there was this kind of, I think I refer to it as a cavalcade or a parade of calamities that befell my family. My father's house burned down, my mother died, my sister to whom I was closest committed a federal crime, quite a stupid one actually. And she had been very politically involved, and then I think she strayed into, whereas I was just dropping acid and being kind of wayward, she fell in with a much harder crowd, and she committed a crime with using firearms, and nobody was harmed. But she was arrested. She was found and arrested, and I posted bail, which was my life savings. At the time, I was 22, I think, and my life savings was $10,000. That literally included everything that I ever made since the days when we had did they call it a passbook that you would take to the bank and they would
savings account?
Yeah, like in your savings account. So that was every penny I'd ever had. I posted bail, and she jumped bail, and she disappeared for the next 22 years, and she lived underground. Ultimately, when it happened, she had an infant. I say when it happened. The passive tense is not right. I mean, when she committed this crime, she had an infant, and she ended up meeting up with her then boyfriend, later husband, and they, that was the plan all along. And there's a scene in the book where I meet with her in Central Park in the conservatory garden, and we're plotting out. I have all the earnest of something. We'll fight this. We'll figure this out. Because I'm the eldest of 4, and so I'd been kind of parenting everybody. I'd been like 40 years old at 4 years old, and I'd been parenting for so long. I was like, we're going to, figure this out. And then I put her on the bus, and she plants what I judged to be a Judas kiss on my cheek, and I didn't see her again for decades. I became a person of very great interest to the FBI, and it was very transformative for me in my life because I was under surveillance, I was interrogated. She kept changing identities, as I later learned. We're in touch now, and it's resolved to some extent. She ultimately was found, extradited, at which point, I have to say, this is not in the book, she was living in very, very remote rural Ohio on a pot plantation raising wolf dogs. It's one's life, that's all I can say.
I loved when she said to you later on, when she said to you, we come from a good family. We were lucky to have a good family.
But she's not wrong in that.
And yes.
She's not wrong, because when she was sent to,
because I think maybe you thought, what do you mean a good family? And she said, the people I met in prison, they didn't come from a good family.
What she meant by that, in all fairness, was that, and I, at the time, and we did come from a good family. The thing is, I'm so far past any kind of blame. Accountability is one thing, but blame, parental blame, it's a no-win proposition. But I'm mindful, she having said this to me, I'm very mindful of the fact that my parents did feed and clothe us. And they did what they could do as people. They just didn't have better tools than they had. When she had this experience of prison, what she goes on to say, it's in the book, is like when you've been in jail with people whose parents have beaten them and prostituted and burned them, you get a little bit of perspective on what we, because we were privileged we were quite privileged.
Well, we're going to take some questions in just a minute, but before that, I'd just like to talk a little bit about Stratford Hall in Virginia, in the Tidewater area of Virginia, because I've spent some time, not just in Tidewater, but actually at Stratford Hall.
Oh, really?
I spent a Thanksgiving there. When you go in, they have well, they used to serve Thanksgiving dinner there, and you could stay and spend the night, which we did with our kids. And this is the birthplace of Robert E. Lee. And my mother was very interested in historic preservation, as was her college roommate, who was called Jean Marie Edwards. And Jean Marie lived just down the road from Stratford Hall, and we would visit them often. So I think it's interesting that you wrote at least a good portion of this book at Stratford.
The greater part of the book was written in a cabin on the grounds of Stratford Hall. It's been it is the ancestral birthplace of the Lees of Virginia, not exclusively Robert E. Lee. He lived there only 3 years till the age of 3.
Yeah.
They have done some serious rebranding, as you may imagine. But on this campus of 2,000 acres, there's this very, very beautiful historic house, which I encourage everybody to visit. The northern neck is totally the land that time forgot. And the directors of this foundation have these log cabins that they use twice a year for their meetings. And a friend is a director, and she said, well, I've got this cabin there that's empty. And I wrote most of the book there. And I didn't, when I started the book, I come from a family, and it's sort of like the drag people, like the history starts now. There was no talk of ancestry, nothing like that. But then once I was there, at a certain point, I thought, well, I'd done my writing for the day, start typing into Ancestry.com, and bizarrely, it turned out that my people had settled in this country in 1653, about 10 miles from where I was writing. I mean, not a thing I had ever known, or could have ever thought to look for. And it was extraordinary. It's a very, 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 rural place. And I can't say that I ever penetrated it both as a Yankee, but also there's a local cafe, and there's always a table of man biddies. I finally got to the point where they would nod after some years.
Well, it's a wonderful book.
Thank you very much.
I enjoyed reading it so much. I know you all will too. Stephanie, are you here? How should we proceed with questions?
Well, first, thank you so much for being here, and we'd like to open it up to questions.
Here's one.
I wonder if God can talk a little bit about his time at the Village Voice in the 70s. I was there as well.
Oh, you go first.
The question was, tell us about your time at the Village Voice.
The Village Voice was, the Village Voice constituted my education. And the Voice of the 70s, there's a oral history of the Voice that came out last year, and it mostly focuses on the squabbles and all the, everybody getting up in each other's grill. But it was an incredible place, and there was so much talent there when I came there, and being an unlettered person, I had the great good luck to be there when, Alex Coburn was there, Nat Hentoff was there. They're not even my headlines. I mean, there was, Karen Durbin, Ellen Willis. It was so many amazing people had fetched up there at one time for a variety of reasons, people, and also for my purposes, very in general, highly educated people. I mean, whereas the headline on The Voice might be that it was this kind of ragtag hippie thing, it was mostly very, very educated people, privileged as well. And so, but they were making this counterculture that now no longer exists. So people, when people say to me, do you miss The Voice? The Voice I don't miss. I've turned the page, but I miss the culture that produced it. You know, I don't know what would stand for counterculture at this point. I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but.
So you talk about coming to New York in this distant past. If you were a young person today, would you still come to New York, or do you think in some way social media has allowed people to produce this kind of culture anywhere?
I really love this question, and for two reasons. One, I think that it's not for me to say what people would do. The city is always going to provide for people in some way, and social media provides in its own sense, right? Like, but I'm very leery of that kind of connectivity. Like, I understand, and my book is about, and even being in a room full of people, like this, the experience of looking at, and the most rewarding thing for me, I'm going off piste here, but about the book tour that I've been on, is this, and being able to connect with people in real time, not thumb tapping, not DMing. And so I think that that's super necessary, but I suppose if it were myself now, I would be in Berlin. Berlin's a little used up, but whatever the next Berlin is. It's funny because, you know, I joke about this, it might even be in the book, that everybody got pushed out of Manhattan, of course, and then into Brooklyn, and then farther into Brooklyn, and then at a certain point I was like, well, go to Portugal.
Now for a completely shallow question. Give me the best day in the 70s in New York, or a day in the life of the 70s. What would you do? Of course you would work, but where would you go in the evening? And then how would you end the evening in the early mornings?
Well, I think you might have a fantasy of how much money I had. So it's a funny thing because when I'm walking around the city now, and this is a bit of geezer gab, but I'm like, everybody's having coffee every minute of the hour of the day, right? Like, I'm like, where's the part where you work and get the money to pay for the coffee? Like, we didn't go to restaurants, we didn't take taxis. I think we just congregated and actually really truthfully made art. So that's what I would have been doing, I think. I think people were pretty focused on that. I mean, it's what you did.
We would go to friends' places and have like a salon. You know, we would
very fancy.
We would drink wine, and maybe beer, and we would talk about how we imagined the future was going to be.
We didn't do that. My perfect day of then would have been dancing. And so when you mentioned Stephen Meisel and Anna Sui and that lot, so there was a bunch of us that would go. This is before I worked at the 10th floor. So we would go dancing. And there was a place, for example, called Tamerlane. There was this kind of not really very successful nightclub in the East 50s. And the owners got the idea of trying to attract a more, groovy crowd by making it free from 5 to 7. And you could go there and dance. And so Stephen and Anna and a posse of our pals would go there, and it had a palm tree in the middle. Ultimately, the whole place went south because somebody was shot there, but that hadn't yet happened, and we would just dance and dance. And dance was a big feature, I have to say. Stephen Meisel, if anybody knows who Stephen Meisel even is, had a very peculiar, even then a very, very evolved sense of himself as, potentially a public figure. The rest of us, not so much. And he would stand in the middle of the dance floor. The rest of us are flailing or doing whatever we're doing. And Stephen would stand in the middle of the dance floor and go. That was his dance.
Just curious how you two obviously know each other, but did you see the Talking Heads? Did you hang out at CBGB's at all?
Oh, we don't know each other.
We just met today. Yes.
Yeah.
That's my
I might wish we had. I mean, I was a huge fan.
So did you frequent CBGB's for that?
I went to CBGB's, but it wasn't my hangout. No, but I've been a huge, huge, huge fan of these guys since ever, really.
Although you said in the book that in your column in The Voice, they wanted you to write about things like cultural events like Talking Heads and stuff like that, and you said, "Oh no, I don't want to write about that."
That's not entirely
people
what I
are
said.
already writing about them.
Well, that's
I
true,
want to
'cause-
write about
yeah.
the people that aren't being
It's
written
true, but
about.
I can see you and raise you one because they actually called the column Talking Heads at first, and I was like, I don't think they're going to be too happy with that.
Oh, hi. I read Patti Smith's book, Just Kids, and so much was placed in the Chelsea Hotel, and Lou Reed and so many others. Did you hang out there at all?
Yeah, there's a lot of the book is at the Chelsea because I became very friendly with the designer Charles James, who in those days was living at the Chelsea. Does anybody know who he is? He's one of the great, great gods of 20th century fashion design. And he was very, very down at heel at that point, was living in a three rooms at the Chelsea that he shared with an incontinent beagle called Sputnik. And I just have to pause for 1 second because I want to paint an image of Charles, who, as I say, is famous. He's in every museum, his designs, and justifiably was great. He was an utter kook. And when he would receive, he was almost invariably wearing like a white Brooks Brothers cotton Oxford shirt with the collar flipped, platform shoes called Chunkies, I think, that he bought on 14th Street, a big black belt cinching the shirt, and Y-fronts. That's it, no pants. He was very fond of his legs.
I have a question. Just sort of, what sort of advice would you give to young creatives, those of us still trying to find our niche, what we want to do or pursue? Kind of how did you find that within yourself, and what sort of advice can you give to me and other young people like me to sort of find that?
I have bad. I mean, are your parents here? I have bad advice. My godson goes to Tulane, and when I did a reading down in New Orleans, he had a friend who was with him who was struggling, and this friend wants to be an artist. His parents are artists, but they really had never made a lot of money, and he was going to go and try and get an MBA. I'm like, don't get the MBA. Just do the art. Like that would, to the extent that it's because. Yeah, you can get the MBA later, if ever. Maybe that's not advice. I just feel like if I had the sense I was born with and really followed this and got a career, I literally would not be here. So believe in it.
This might be a simple question, but why did you write the book, or why did you want to write the book?
Yeah, I think it's a book, because I had a story to tell, I think, at the end. I mean, people ask me a lot if it's cathartic. No, it wasn't catharsis at all. But I had a story to tell, right? I think that was mostly it. And also, I was immensely arrogant when I signed the contract. And I thought, I've been writing for a million years. I've got this, little knowing. It was sort of like being a sprinter and thinking you can just put on some different sneakers and run the marathon. Because as a journalist, I'm used to the quick hits and I get it done. And this was a very, very different thing. And it took me longer than it ought to have, partly because I had this, fairly demanding waitressing job at the Times. So.
One thing I wanted to ask earlier, Andre Leon Talley, Did you have any contact
Sure.
with Andre?
Yeah.
I figured you must have done
Yeah.
in your work. What a character he was.
I want to say one thing about this, and I know we're keeping people far too long, and thank you everybody for coming. But what I really miss, recently Polly Mellon died, and she was this great fashion editor lady, but also completely gaga. And she spoke a kind of what I think of as fashion English. And it's like a dead language now, but I really miss the days when people spoke crazy fashion English, because I was once in Paris with Andre, and we were going to some obligatory fashion party, and he was in some immense cape and situation. Neither one of us wanted to be there. And he said, just tuck yourself behind me and we'll glissade. You know? And then people like Polly Mellon would say things like, I hate green. I also love green. You know? It's like nutty. I don't even know you'll ever, you'll never find it again. Thank you all for coming.
And
Thank you all.
Guy and Chris will be here at the back signing
Yeah,
books.
you did great.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah, we can turn this. Oh, it's a great pleasure. And now we get to go to dinner. Oh, sure.
I'm kind of half dressed. We do.
Oh, okay. Would you like a better angle?